Welcome to episode 44 of the Necronama.com. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now, and I don't think that my mother would like my many comparisons I made while watching this movie.
And I am Don Guillory, author, historian, educator. Yeah, this made me seriously question some things that have taken place in my family when I watched this film the first time as well as the second time.
Really fast, before I get to our guests, I want to say I didn't like this film the first time I saw it. And rewatching it, I liked it so much more. So if anyone out there, A, if you haven't seen it, we're going to spoil the living shit out of it. And B, if you have and you didn't particularly care for it, I really suggest watching it again. And if you loved it, hey, watch it again because you love it. Joining us today is author Gemma Amor. Gemma, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
So I know I've read at least one of your books and I've listened to a couple of your podcast episodes. Why don't you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a horror fiction author. I am from Bristol in the United Kingdom, and I've been writing full time for about 2 years. So I'm kind of just 2.5 years into trying to make this writing gig stick. And I'm not doing too badly. I've got 4 books out at the moment. I'm mostly self-published now. I've worked with a few indie publishers, but indie publishing is a fragile industry. So I'm kind of quite happy self-publishing my own stuff. I have 4 books, one of which has just been nominated for a Bram Stoker Award, although I didn't win, but it was very nice to get the nomination. And I also write for a number of horror fiction podcasts. The No Sleep podcast is probably the most famous one. They're like a multi-million download horror anthology show.
Oh, yeah.
Brand new stories every week. Fantastic. Been going for quite a while now. I write for them. I write for another slightly more genteel podcast called Shadows at the Door, which is very British, very M.R. James. And I also co-write and co-act. I'm a voice actor too. Very amateur voice actor. In a show which is a comedy horror podcast starring Kate Siegel called Calling Darkness. So,
awesome.
Yeah, I have my fingers in lots of different pies at the moment. Sticky fingers.
That's great. So, yeah. I've listened to some No Sleep stuff, and I haven't checked out the others, but I'm going to now. That sounds great. But I did read Dear Laura. I loved Dear Laura. So, and I am incredibly sorry that the Stokers were finally supposed to be in London, and then, COVID. I was. I wasn't in a position to be able to afford to go last year because they were in the US, and then this year I thought, brilliant. But they've been reorganised for August, so fingers crossed. Maybe we'll be out of lockdown by then. Maybe things will have calmed down a little bit. Who knows? I certainly hope so.
Yeah, me too.
I kind of mentioned that I didn't really care for Hereditary the first time I watched it. How did each of you feel about it the first time that you saw it?
Oh, man. I think you and I have talked about this before. I must have been in a really bad mood when I saw it the first time. And as I've told James and told people before, a lot of stuff that I watch that people say is horror for me, it's a lot of comedy in horror. So I find things funny that shouldn't be funny. Like when Toni Collette's character is crawling all over the walls and banging her head. And I'm sitting there like, this is funny as shit. This is hilarious. But if I were a teenage boy and that was my mom, I would not think it was too funny. But no, when I saw the movie the first time, there were parts of it that I felt dragged on, and I didn't appreciate until the second and third viewing of the film. because I saw where things connected. I saw the imagery, the symbolism that was being represented. But like I said, that first time, it took me a while to watch it a second time just to get what I'd perceived as a bad taste in my mouth, or a bad taste out of my mouth. When really, I think it just probably just came down to I was maybe in a bad mood when I saw it.
What about you, Gemma?
I had a very, very different. In a former life, I used to write movie reviews as well for the odd website, and I wrote a review of Midsommar, which is Asta's other film, the big one. And my opening gambit for that review was that horror doesn't need to be scary to be horror. And
right.
I'm a firm believer that the genre is extremely fluid. And very malleable, and you can do an awful lot within the realm of horror that doesn't necessarily have to be this scared the shit out of me within the first 30 minutes. So when I kind of went into it, I knew very little about the film. I knew everybody had spoken about it and raved about it. I always end up watching everything about a year after everybody else because I don't like hype, and it sort of ruins things for me. So I kind of deliberately waited, and I watched it about a year after it was released, and I went in very open-minded, and I think maybe part of that is the more I write and the more I sort of genre blend myself with like comedy horror in this and cosmic horror in that and folk horror. It's made me realise how versatile the horror genre is,
Right.
and should be. So if you look at movies like The Lighthouse, for example, which is essentially a relationship film about two dudes, it's not really a horror movie. It's got horrific elements in it, and that's it should be. And Annihilation is more science fiction than horror, but it's sold as a horror movie. So, you know, the horror as a concept is sort of spreading and becoming quite gooey around the edges, which I like. So I went into Hereditary very open-minded. I found the first, 27 minutes or however it is until that scene, very slow, and I was not terribly engaged, and I had half an eye on the telly because I wasn't really. It was much more of a family drama, which is exactly what Asta was going for anyway. And then that scene hit, and
it hits all right.
I remember shouting at the television screen, "What the fuck?" If I can swear, sorry, I'm probably not supposed to swear.
Oh no, we swear fucking constantly on here, so
fine,
that's fine.
I don't know what the fucking problem is.
It's my happy place then. But it literally knocked my socks off. I was so unprepared for it, and the realization then hit me that that's exactly what Asta had been doing and wanted. He wanted to lure you in. He wanted to get you into a frame of mind where you thought you knew what this film was, and it was perhaps a bit dreary, and it was very family oriented, and then bam. And then from that point, it ramped up so continuously that it was just exhausting. And brilliant. And I loved every single second of it. And I watched it again about 3 weeks later, going into it knowing what was happening. And then I noticed all the Easter eggs and the little clues and the things that he's so fond of sprinkling around a movie.
And he's so good at that.
So good at it. And it blew me away. And again, I can't talk about Midsommar because someone else has snaffled it, but little details in that movie too, like Florence Pugh falling asleep, and she's got a coverlet over her, and it's the floor carpet print from the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Like tiny little details like that you don't necessarily pick up on the first viewing. And I think his movies are meant to be watched again and again and again. And I love that. I absolutely loved it. So yeah, it was shall we say there aren't many films that genuinely shock me, and that genuinely knocked my socks off the first time I saw that scene.
That's awesome. So I knew about that scene going in, and the shock still hit me because I was like, holy shit, we're like 30 minutes in. Like I thought this was going to be way later, and then it hit, and I was like, wow.
And it's so visceral. And the point that is actually a starting point for what follows rather than like the climax, so that you wouldn't think it would get more climactic than some girl's head coming off when she leans out the car window, and you sort of think you know where it's going. Maybe she's going to choke to death or, have an allergic reaction and whatever, asphyxiate. But bam, and then the scene where Alex Wolff has driven the car home and he's just sitting in the car about to go inside, having just inadvertently murdered his own sister. It's just horrendous, and it's impossible to think it could get worse than that, but it genuinely does as the film progresses. I think that's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
For me, I'm going to argue almost the direct opposite, and yet I still totally agree with what you said. It's just I have really bad ADHD when it comes to movies, right?
Okay.
So the mere fact that this was supposed to be 3 hours long originally would have been a huge turnoff for me. I would have instantly been like, there's no way I can do that. I know how I am, and I'm going to phase out halfway through, you know? And I loved the beginning. I liked all the... I'm really into characterization and like motivation for characters and like what makes them each tick. And like, I was really getting into the family. And then the second half of the film is where I kind of space off. Like, so while there is a lot happening, it's almost like, I don't want to say there's too much coming at me, but I feel like the pacing just doesn't work with my brain. Like I totally get why other people love it. It just, it's what I didn't like about it the first time, and I noticed it again this time, but I was able to pay better attention because I knew what was happening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think, again, that's something that criticism's leveled at Midsommar a lot as well. The pacing it's either all or nothing. And when you sort of combine that with the heavy elements of comedy in that movie as well, it makes for uncomfortable viewing. And I think that is exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to make you uncomfortable as fuck. You're sitting there, you think with so many horror movies, you know what's coming and it's formulaic and you're there to enjoy the ride and you don't care about any of that stuff. You just want the monsters and the ghoulies and the jump scares and all that shit. But he wants to make your skin crawl, and he does it with the music, he does it with the visuals, he does it with the pacing and the dialogue and everything. He is extremely good at understanding what makes us uncomfortable and leverage. I think that's an extraordinary gift, actually. I'm a eulogizer for Ari Aster's work. I can't get it.
I was comparing it to like a dimmer switch. Like the tension's always there. And it's like he just like moves the switch a little bit. So sometimes it's a lot more and sometimes it's less. But he does it in a way where there's no real rhythm to it.
Yeah.
So you can't expect it. And that just like constantly leaves you in this state of unease, as you were saying.
I totally agree. And what Don was saying earlier was interesting as well about the visuals. Like you found quite amusing, actually. And there are two scenes at the end which are extraordinary. And they're both Toni Collette, and in one she's kind of banging her head repeatedly against the attic door, which looks ridiculous because she's hanging upside down and it's sped up a bit and it looks daft. But like you say, imagine you were in that position. Mm-hmm. And then, 5 minutes later she's flossing her own head off with some cheese wire or whatever it is. And it's so ridiculous. You do sort of chuckle, but actually laughing at something you find so shocking you're not quite sure how to process is a very common response.
Right.
And I think that maybe also, you remember it. You laughed at it and you remember it. It's not like you watch Sharknado and you giggle and then you instantly forget all the CG and all that shit.
Right.
But with this you really genuinely remember, and it's pervasive and it stays, and you can remember what scene it was that you giggled at because maybe you found it funny, but that visual is still stuck in your brain. And I think that's where he's very clever. And it's sort of, you do have to go in, not open-minded, what's the word? Not take with a pinch of salt, but with that attitude, you do have to sort of suspend disbelief. But then again, that's the same in any horror movie, I think. Whether it's Freddy Krueger or something slightly more literary.
As an author, for me, when I look at what he does with plot, the reason that I think that you remember so much is that everything in his plots serves a purpose. Not everything in Sharknado serves a purpose. It's just there to...
That film serves a purpose.
I accept your challenge, and I'm going to find the social commentary in Sharknado, and we will.
If I can segue,
I will do this in a future episode.
If you want to have me back to talk about like the last Sharknado movie, in which Tara Reid is in a time tunnel, and she's been turned into a shark robot.
Whoa. I haven't seen any of these movies. That happens?
It's Sharknado. You won't remember it in 5 minutes. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I remember the last Sharknado movie. I didn't remember the other 7 or whatever. But I've just seen it.
But yeah, I mean, his plotting is so tight. Like, lines matter. It's like Jordan Peele. Every line has multiple meanings, It's so great. And I think that that's why it's so powerful and why you remember the scenes.
It reminded me of... Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, speaking of lines, since James brought that up, one that stood out to me, especially rewatching it and rewatching again, was when the daughter says, when Toni Collette's character after the funeral was like, should I be sadder? And then the daughter, complaining about the mother and saying like, she wanted me to be a boy. And just kind of how those are thrown in as you said, Gemma, this idea of it's about the family, it's about the dysfunction that's there. And it's that relatable stuff when you're not realizing this is about, what we're going to be led into in that second half of the film about, the estrangement that she had with her own mother. And of course, the idea that the grandmother wanted, this child to be a boy and was upset. Oh, damn, it's not a boy. It's like another girl.
I think many, both Midsommar and Hereditary are rooted in the concept of family, and Hereditary is more motherhood, and Midsommar is more about the family as a collective and finding a place and finding a home. But I think that's why these films are sometimes so hard to swallow, because particularly with the dynamic in Hereditary, where there's an extremely strained relationship, and as it goes through, you begin to realize why. It makes for very uncomfortable viewing because it's extremely believable. James, you were saying you've got a teenage son, and I remember being extremely finding it very hard to get along with my own mother when I was a young girl myself, and the dynamic was so cleverly written. And then as it ramps up and as it goes through, you realize that not only is I forget what Tony's character is, Annie. Annie, not only is she dealing with the fact that her mother was a devil-worshipping psychopath, but she whatever trauma she's been through. I mean, they lost a family member, presumably to this cult. Was it her brother? I think at the very beginning it says. Not only is she dealing with all the trauma to do with that from her own life, she's then struggling to relate to her own family, and her trauma has then traumatized her own relationship with her son, when she nearly sets him on fire one night in his sleep, and no wonder he finds it hard to trust her. And it's just the layers that peel back before the film goes on. It's all so excruciating to watch and so brilliantly acted. And that very famous scene where they're sat around the dinner table and she erupts, and she's like a boiling pot just waiting for the lid to blow. And Toni Collette should have won an Oscar for that performance, and I do genuinely believe that that's one of the finest performances I've ever seen her in, because it's so raw and it's so it hit really close to home to me. I think most people have a complicated relationship with their mother anyway, and that was just painted out so beautifully that it was hard to swallow. It was a hard pill to swallow.
So back to what Don was saying really fast about she wanted me to be a boy. If you're really paying attention, when they open the book with Paymon's description, it says, let me find it here. When successfully invoked, Paymon will possess the most vulnerable host. To me, the entire backstory here is that Grandma completed the ritual while the child was in the womb, and she didn't know it wasn't a boy.
Right.
Right? And so, I find, you have this whole backstory that's never explained.
It's referenced, isn't it? I think that Paymon kind of prefers a male form. There's snippets of the book that you see throughout, I think, where it's very briefly mentioned. And again, I think it is Annie's brother, isn't it, that died in the past, and presumably that's a failed attempt at him being a host or something along those lines. Like,
yeah, he committed suicide because she kept trying to put people in him.
Which, fair enough. There's a lot of foreshadowing, isn't there? And I think like you said earlier, like there is no plot point that that doesn't have a purpose. There's no hook that isn't tied off at the end. I think that's really difficult to do as well from a purely from a writing point of view, from a technical writing point of view, keeping track of all those threads and doing it that masterfully.
I guess
yeah.
Like, my one big question is, as soon as Charlie was born, why didn't they speed this up? Like, why did we wait 13 years? Why did we have to wait till Grandma dies? Like, that's my one big question here.
Maybe the body has to be a certain physical strength to be able to contain the host, or
well, having been in a number of cults myself, no, I'm just kidding. No, I, both of you bring up that good point. It is a good question to ask as far as the health and the strength of that body versus the age, as far as the person that's going to, assume the role as the host now, or at least the vessel. So I don't know, maybe because there's even that hint that the director gives where, or at least using the miniatures to tell the story as well, to where the grandmother is breastfeed, or at least pulling out her breast to feed her granddaughter or grandchild. I don't know, maybe just to help transfer the energy, the spirit of this demon. I don't know. There are a lot of good questions that are asked, and I think we covered this before, James. But really good films like this leave you with questions, but questions that make you wonder, what else is possible, or how else could this work, as opposed to those annoying and nagging questions of, oh, why'd they do this when this made so much more sense? And I don't think you really have that with this one. It's more an issue of curiosity based off of what you've been given.
There's also, I think, a pervasive concept with possession movies, possession literature and stuff, that the young host is normally like on the cusp of puberty as well. And just thinking to like The Exorcist is a really good example, and the age of the girl is what, she's like 12, maybe 11. That kind of prepubescent or just about to turn into an adult. And like The Possession of Emily Rose, she's 17 or 18, isn't she? I don't know. It just feels like maybe there's an argument perhaps for that kind of, that period of your life being mythical in some way and mythologized as you turn from child to adult, and that kind of special time. I don't know. I'm just bullshitting.
I mean, I could see how that would work, because, my initial response to that would be, but they put it into an unborn child. So that kind of ruins the physical thing. But then I think maybe they went, see, that was stupid. We shouldn't do that. And so I'm sitting here and I'm literally staring at my note, which says the most vulnerable, the most vulnerable. It has to be a super vulnerable person in order for Paimon to take over. And I'm thinking, if he was a 5-year-old boy or a 6-year-old boy, maybe you can't make him vulnerable enough. Maybe he has to be at this age. When you're 17, 18, like, everything is emotionally heavy and you're dealing with so much shit and you're pulled in so many directions. And then they literally take Peter and they just beat the fuck out of him throughout this entire movie.
He's also got that history with Annie, she did, like, he did wake up in the middle of the night and find her covering him in petroleum or whatever it was. Like, there is that turmoil is there, that his sister doesn't necessarily have, and that she's not a very well-adjusted child herself, but she seems to be okay with, like, making toys out of dead pigeon heads and stuff like that. She's not your average kid.
Well, yeah, but she's had the demon in her most of her life. Like, that's why she makes that clicking sound, you know?
That horrible sound. And that's the other thing I love about his movies, and that Midsommar also has, is the mouth noises and the little hand gestures and the physical bodily things that, again, are really laughable and really mockable, but they make something iconic. And I think that's over time, when you look back on this film and anybody makes that noise, you'll go, ooh, and you'll get the heavers, because it's horrible. She was a creepy ass kid, and you know.
Full disclosure, I made that noise for about a week after my wife and I saw the film, and got on her nerves. She's like, "Stop doing that."
Yeah, because it's grating, but it's also really, I don't know. It's the same sort of thing as the first time I watched Ringu, and the phone ringing at the end of the video, the cursed video. And I remember watching it, and my brother-in-law rang the phone in the office from the next room that I was watching, and I nearly gave birth, and I wasn't even pregnant. I was so scared. And it's just those little things, those little things that you hang on to, visually or otherwise. I think they're very clever. They make something much more memorable as well.
Well, I think it's amazing how he also used a clicking sound to tell a story. Like, Charlie makes it throughout the beginning, and we just think, well, Charlie's a little off, you know? Like, that's just Charlie, whatever. But then, when Paimon starts to attack Peter, and he's, like, hovering around him in the classroom, he keeps hearing the clicking sound around him, which, from his point of view, is Charlie.
Yeah.
But it's actually this king of hell. And then once it takes over him, he starts actively making the sound. And I think it's amazing how this one simple sound tells so much story.
Yeah.
And I'm so impressed with Aster's ability to do that kind of stuff.
Because it's a tricky concept, right? There was another movie in the 90s about the devil hopping from like one person to the next, and there was a series of murders, and it was all quite formulaic. I forget who was in it. I want to say Keanu Reeves.
Fallen with Denzel Washington.
Denzel Washington, that's it, yeah. And then so the only way you know who is possessed is you see through the possessed person's eyes, and it's like black and white or something. I can't really remember, but it's a tricky concept to like portray something you can't see skipping from one corporeal form to another. So just that simple sound, like you say, signaling that that's what's happening, is very simple, and it's very, very effective. And it's quite chilling as well. It's quite a chilling just idea that your body is like an open vessel to whatever evil, is out there. And I love the idea you can symbolize that with a mouth noise.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me. On that note, the opposite is also true to me. Like, Charlie has this allergy, and it's so great that this all-powerful king of hell, who's like the right hand of Satan and just like one of the most evil motherfuckers ever, but my host has a peanut allergy.
I have problems coming to like terms with the idea that Charlie is ever possessed by Paimon, if that makes sense. Like, my interpretation of it was that she's just really, really weird. And that the host was waiting for the boy the whole way through. Like, I never really, I went back and read some of the trivia later and just confused myself even more, but I think everyone interprets it slightly differently, but I never really saw her as being possessed by him. I don't know. I don't know why, but it just, like you said, she had the peanut allergy. She was, yeah. She didn't look like an ideal choice, does she?
So, and that's exactly where my theory, and I'm not saying it's mine, like I've read other people online that think the same way, but it really comes down to like, she had to die because she had Paimon in her. And that's why then it's released and it's able to go somewhere else.
Able to jump posts, yeah.
And like the evidence for that is that the sigil for Paimon is on the post that takes her head off. And so the theory is like all of this was set up to make her die, like by using his powers and stuff to make it happen.
It appears in a few other places as well. I think it appears in is it Granny's house at the beginning? Isn't it on her doormat? I think she has a doormat, and there's a scene where she opens the door and it's on the doormat. Maybe I'm getting that confused.
Yeah, it's on her necklace. It's on Annie's necklace. It's in so many places in this film. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely could be. I don't know if it's on a floor mat, but maybe.
I did read a very involved explanation of the history of Paimon and how he came to be into the world, and I don't know where I read it. I think it was on a fan forum somewhere on Reddit, but I've completely forgotten all of it because it was just such a complex mythology. It's like I read in the trivia on IMDb said that Ari Aster sat down and wrote full character bios for all of his characters before he even sat down and wrote the screenplay, and then all the backstories and everything he had fixed firmly in his mind before he even sat down and wrote any of the dialogue or any of the action. So he's built this huge world. He's a world builder. Again, and there's just so much to take in and so much detail. It's hard to like get a fix on it sometimes.
So what about you, Don? Where do you fall on whether Charlie is possessed or not?
I'm gonna agree with you because that was what I started to argue myself when I was watching and rewatching this film, was either Paimon was in her. It was a flawed body, or quote unquote flawed body to have. She gets killed in order to release him. And then Charlie is now in a more weakened state. I'm sorry, Peter is in a more weakened and vulnerable state because he's lost his sister. Mom is, getting on his case about all this other stuff, and then reuniting with the seance and all this stuff. I think that becomes the catalyst of Paimon being able to take him over, because nothing really seems to start for him until until his sister has died. Mm. So it's either because he now is in that ultimate weakened state, and just kind of, distracted by, the grief of what's taking place, so much to where he's trying to fill that void with marijuana and getting high, and he can't even get high with his friends. And he starts to, have that panic attack and freak out, or at least it's assumed it was a panic attack.
I loved that scene as well. I thought actually, like, the concept of him being expected to just return to normal life, and all his buddies sitting around, and they're aware that something horrendous has happened, and they obviously care about him, but it hasn't touched them at all, and they're just carrying on as normal. And he's in literal and virtual hell, just trying to have a joint and be normal, and he can't because his world has now changed forever. I mean, even if he wasn't trying to be possessed by the evil spirit of Paimon, then his life would also be changed forever anyway, and he's going to be traumatized for the rest of his life. So it's like that realization hits you and him almost at the same time, that like everything is now fucked and there is no hope. And it's like, again, I read some trivia, like the movie is about suffering. Ari Aster wrote a movie about suffering. Yes. And that is exactly what you see for everybody here. Nobody gets an easy ride here at all.
No one can return back to no one can return to normal, or at least what a concept of normal is.
No, exactly.
Because Annie, destroys her displays that would have gone to be presented. The family's breaking, like the dad, played by Gabriel Byrne. Like he's the most sympathetic character to me, because he's trying to manage all the chaos around him, to where you don't even see how he's dealing with any of this, because there's so much focus on Peter and Annie, to where it seems like he doesn't get to have any emotions about what's taking place, because he's worried about, one, his dead daughter, his son, and his wife, who had just lost her mother as well. So it's kind of like, I have to be strong for everybody here. I can't, I can't even understand what my normal is like. So I have to take care of you guys.
Yeah, and it's interesting that his comeuppance comes when he finally snaps at the end. He's finally had enough of all of Annie's bullshit,
Right.
And he's finally had enough of her kind of crazy behavior, and then she starts spouting off about a dead body in the attic, and he finds it with her, and he just realizes then nothing I'm doing is working. It's all gone to shit. And when he finally snaps and breaks that like calm, I'm a strong dad exterior, then that's it. His life is over. And I loved that build up of him as well. Like you say, he's kind of in the background a bit. It's mostly focused on Annie, and he's just quietly there, but he's quietly again suffering throughout all of it. And until his rather fiery end. And I think you do feel so sorry for him. But also at the same time, you want him to believe Annie, because she's clearly not very well, but she needs to be believed, and rightly so. And it's that kind of, you're torn then between, why don't you believe your wife? And, okay. Annie's a very unlikable character. So, and I think that's the other thing about this, is the likability of the characters. Like Gabriel Byrne is probably the only halfway likable one, Steve, in like the whole movie. So.
Yeah, I was reading that originally there was going to be a backstory of how Annie and Steve met, and he was a psychologist and she was one of his patients. And I was like, I'm so glad they didn't include that, because that would make me dislike him more. Yeah. You know, and I don't think that we need that at all. Like, I think it's fine the way it is. As it is, he's putting out fires that he doesn't even tell them about. You know, like, Grandma's fucking grave got desecrated, and not just a little bit. Somebody didn't, like, you know, draw a frowny face on it. Like, they destroyed the whole damn thing, you know. And he's not even telling anybody. I was trying to make it as easy as possible, but no, like, you know, he's dealing with this thing that would normally be a gigantic problem, and he's taking care of it himself because he doesn't want to inflict that pain on his family. Yeah. And so when I look at like the original origin story of these two, I'm like, oh my God, I'm glad you cut that, because I don't think it fits with his character at all.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because she's a very vulnerable person, and despite having quite a hard exterior, she's an insanely vulnerable person. So the idea of her psychologist kind of crossing that boundary and with a vulnerable patient, it doesn't really gel, does it? But then maybe it also explains some of their complicated dynamic. Like, Annie clearly resents Steve quite a lot. There's a lot of resentment there. She resents her family in general, I think. And maybe that would be a good way of explaining why, perhaps. There's like a big age gap between them as well, I think, isn't there? And
yeah. Well, and there's the fact that he stayed with her after, you know, she doused her kids in paint thinner and tried to light them on fire. So maybe he's not all there either. I don't know.
It would be pretty hard to come
somewhere
back from
else.
that, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would be hard to come back from that. You would be hard pressed not to see how, like, child protection services weren't involved, and but then these things do actually happen, and it is, you know, we kind of scoff at all this stuff.
Yeah.
But like, so if we're just like, again, that whole suspension of disbelief and what we think is reasonable and what isn't behaviour, and then you look at what's happening around us at the moment, you look at the kind of pandemic situation we're in, and then you look at all the memes flying around about, like, my apologies go out to Jurassic Park, because actually rich people will keep open if it kills people, and all this behaviour that we think is extraordinary and unrealistic actually in some situations isn't. Like, you know, you watch Tiger King. I mean, fuck, like, people are weird sometimes, and they don't always obey the kind of societal norms and stuff. So again, like, the idea of suspending that part of your disbelief and just embracing the complex and awful dynamic that's going on, I think makes his films much easier. And maybe that's why they're better to watch a second time round as well, like you say. Maybe that's why you hate it the first time, and then you go back the second time and rewatch it, because it sort of is more believable the more you think about it.
That's a good point. One of my big ones was, why wasn't Peter arrested? Like,
well, my take on that was that he's a child, He's still a child. Like, I don't know how your age limits work in the US, but like, unless you're 18 here, you're not an adult.
Yeah, so the main way that it works in the US is if you're black, you're automatically going to jail.
Oh god.
And then if you're rich and you're male, then you probably have a really good life ahead of you, and we shouldn't hold you back in any way. And then there's some stuff in between, but those are the two big ones.
So I mean, it was obviously an accident. It wasn't an intentional, like, no court of law would be able to prove that he intentionally made his sister hang her head out of the window and then drove into a telegraph pole. So I'm assuming he would have reported it as an accident, and then there would have been maybe a police inquiry or something, and he would, because he was a child or a young adult, then they just let that go. Like, again, it's feasible. It is kind of feasible.
It is.
There's different degrees of death, aren't there? So I think it's when it's with intent that then you're kind of culpable.
Well, and I think it actually makes a lot of sense that he doesn't tell them right away. Like, he doesn't come home and go wake up his parents and he's like, you know, like, why should he? Why should he trust these people to help him in his time of need?
That scene as well where Annie goes out to the car the next morning and then you just hear the screams. It was just so... They could have made that so much more gratuitous and shown all of that in detail, but you never actually see her. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't linger on the details of her discovering her own child's body. It's just what you hear, and then you sort of... I think it zooms in on Peter's face, doesn't it? As the scream kind of echoes through the house. And that's when you think, oh my God, imagine being in that situation. Imagine being in that kid's shoes. You've done something terrible, you know, the worst thing you can possibly have done in the whole world. And now you have to live with that. Again, it was like, almost made me sort of feel a bit nauseous. It was so well done.
Definitely. I like that we get both sides of this, because we get the, I call it the Anakin Skywalker effect, where we don't see the terror, and then my brain fills in the really horrible details, right? And we get that while she's screaming, but then we get the awesome, grotesque visual of the head sitting out there covered in ants.
Yeah, you get that, but for a split second only. It doesn't linger. It's like blink and you miss it.
Yeah.
Which again is that there are certain scenes, like at the very end scene in the treehouse, and you're never really allowed to focus on Paimon in any great detail, or on the headless corpse, or on Granny's blackened corpse that's kneeling in respect, or whatever. You don't get to focus on that. The camera pulls away almost straight away, and then pulls back and pulls back and pulls back, and what you're seeing is that long shot as it pulls back. You're not kind of confronted with any gory details for any length of time. And I think that allows your imagination to fill in so many gaps as well. Like, and you want to see more, but your brain is doing the work for you.
If James had been in the movie theater with me, this is what has been deemed a black react, where in the movie theater, I would have probably jumped. Well, I did. He would have seen me jump up and say, "Oh shit, that was great. That was a great kill. That was awesome." Because one, you're so distracted. We talked about, just taking someone's attention or fixating their attention somewhere else. We are thinking Charlie's going to die from anaphylactic shock, or or Peter's going to have a car. He's going to run into another car or something. But what was great was that quick split second where you understand, boom, she hit the tree. And then second, when they go back to her face or go back to her head that is just sitting on the side of the road, because that is not just about the incident that took place, not just about her death, but just the grief that everyone has, and the guilt, the blame that everyone feels related to that, whether it's Peter or whether it's Annie. Because even when they have that fight at the dinner table, it's Annie blaming Peter for it, saying, well, you're responsible for her, blah, blah, blah. And then Peter turns and says, hey, she didn't even want to go to the party. And just how everything starts coming apart. Well, it's been coming apart, but you see how everything has come to a head for these two, where you shouldn't be blaming each other about this girl's death in the first place. But this is where we are. Mm-hmm. And even when it comes down to grandma's death, that finally, I'm sorry, not grandmother's death, but the body finally coming back after Stephen had that phone conversation with the cemetery saying, hey, you know, her grave has been defiled. It's someone has done whatever to it. And it's very vague as far as what's happened. But then you see that body that's there and you're just thinking, holy shit, like this is a committed cult. But the shock of just that second or two where you see both bodies after, of course, Toni Collette's cut her head off. You see both bodies there prostrating in front of Gaiman, that idea of, or excuse me, Payman, the idea that they are so committed to this that they even want the deceased members there to pay their respects. And I'm surprised that someone didn't dig up, I mean, even though she wasn't a member of this, someone didn't dig up Charlie as this former vessel that Payman had been in and had her there as well.
It's reminded me as well of a scene where Annie is trying to process her grief and she's working on a diorama and she's working on the diorama of the accident. And there's a tiny little car with the door open and blood on the door and a tiny little head and a tiny little telegraph pole. And it's so shocking to us that she would want to recreate that scene in that minute detail, but that's her way of processing her grief and her trauma, by kind of laying it all out in detail. And I think when you sort of like conceptually, that's what Ari Aster then does with the movie. Like the movie is played out in a series of rooms, like the tree house, inside the house, inside the car, inside a schoolroom. They're mimicked by all these little dioramas throughout, but then you move around the space in a really, really similar way. Mm-hmm. And just the idea of like Don was saying, like all these things and all this foreshadowing and all of that stuff delivered on its own would be a good movie, but then when you frame it with this clever little framing device as well, and this clever visual framing device, it's sort of, it's like an extra layer that your brain has to cope with, if that makes sense, mm-hmm. as you're watching the film. What Don was saying just really reminded me of that scene where she's just kind of painting detail onto something to do with her daughter's horrific, tragic death. And I think that's the thing with this movie. Like, the more you think about it, the more you remember as well. The more little things you remember, and the more detail that there is.
You know, I was thinking about what you just said, Don, about Charlie not being there at the end, and I can't help but wonder, like, it works for both theories. If on the one hand Charlie was possessed, then she was a failed vessel and they don't need her for anything.
Right.
But on the other hand, if she wasn't good enough, they also don't need her for anything. Like, Charlie doesn't strike me as having any reverence for Payman or having any desire to join in the family religion or whatever you want to call it here. You know, like, I don't think it's weird that she's not there, but I kind of wonder, like, if it fuels either of those two theories.
Well, you know, being in, I guess, I don't want to say ultra religious families, but if you've ever been in a family that takes their religion seriously, and I'm speaking as somebody who was coerced, when we say coerced, I was encouraged to attend religious obligations, and I could see it to where the mom, the mother, as far as the grandmother, she would have had instructions of just kind of like with that seance that had been passed down, like everybody has to be in the house. There would have been those instructions of, well, you know, your faith isn't strong if your entire family isn't there. Or, you know, if your mom is the only one who goes to church, that's going to look bad for her, because she's going to have to face all these people and they're going to ask you, you know, why isn't your dad there? Why isn't your husband there? Why isn't your daughter or your son? So for me, you know, looking at this from the perspective of some, you know, having to go to like summer revivals and stuff like that, it's one of those things that I would see with any religious group. Why isn't this person here? Or, if we're really serious about this and this is supposed to be the offspring of the previous host, then all these other people should be here as well, whether they were good vessels or not.
Interesting. Gemma, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking as well, like almost to support your theory. I'm just recalling Charlie's scribbles in her notebook as well at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
Which are kind of indicative that she's kind of friends with some evil stuff in the sense of the stuff she's drawing and the imagery. And then again, there's also the foreshadowing with the playing around with the head. Making dolls out of things with a decapitated head on. Do you know what I mean? She chops the bird's head off, doesn't she?
Yes.
With a pair of scissors. That decapitation and again, I wonder whether that's maybe a support in your theory that she has been possessed all along, and that's Paimon acting through her. Because I remember this. I can't remember exactly what it is she draws in her book, but it's something that then Annie finds a bit later, isn't it? And it's revealing in the sense that she's drawing stuff she shouldn't really be drawing. And whether that's because she's kind of psychologically a very disturbed child or she's got something else going on there. I wish I could remember where I found all of this, like, backstory and explanation. I'm pretty sure it was on Reddit. I'll have to dig it out and send it to you.
Awesome. And then there's the drawings of Peter later where his eyes are crossed out.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to me because, the eyes are the window to the soul. Yeah. And it's very heavy symbolism about his soul. And of course, Peter's soul has to leave the body in order for Paimon to take over.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm stuck. Did those drawings come from Charlie from the beginning, or were they the ones that were like magically appearing later during the seance? She has a notebook at the beginning and she scribbles in it, and I remember that. But I can't remember exactly what it is that she draws, so I couldn't.
The funeral, she draws the mom, I guess it's supposed to be her grieving, but it's kind of a grotesque drawing of the mother. And then Stephen kind of looks at her and is like, hey, you might want to put that away. This isn't a place to draw. Which, at that moment, it's part of that misdirection because you're like, she's a kid. What the hell is she? Kids don't want to be at funerals.
Yeah.
And they don't want creepy guys standing in the corner smiling at them.
Oh, God.
Oh, I forgot that. I forgot that scene. That was amazing. There's just some cult dude, wasn't there, in the house? And
yeah, because later he's naked, yeah.
Standing there naked. I remember that now as well. There's so many little moments like that. There's, like you said, there's so much. It's almost too much, isn't it, to, take in and do justice to?
Actually, that also makes more sense if she's Paimon, because he'd be excited to see the deity,
Yeah.
And then that would kind of explain his creepy ass smile instead of the way I think most of us took it.
It's very layered. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I like that, and I think that's why I enjoy it so much, because if something can keep my interest, for particularly in the horror genre, which everything's been done at least once, if not multiple times. And particularly because horror is it's attractive to franchises, and franchises make you tired. Like when you watch films, you think, oh, I'm tired of this. It's fun, but I'm tired, and then so if anything can keep, not only keep your attention for that long, but then continually confound you, and you're still talking about it now and you still don't know what the fuck was going on. It's I like that. And there are other movies that do that as well, like the original Wicker Man. The more you watch and look at the inhabitants of Summer Isle and things are going on there, little scenes and stuff, the more I don't remember that the first time I saw this movie. It's rich, and I love that. Layers. I like layers in a film.
Well, this movie has a lot of layers.
It really does. It's like an onion. It's like Shrek.
Yes, definitely.
Like you said, the original cut of the movie was 3.5 hours long or something as well. And can you imagine knowing the finished version of this film? Can you imagine knowing what has been cut as well? Like how much detail there must be cut and how many little things and do you know what I mean? It's how much more was there that they had to be more conservative in order to get it like a cinema release. And I love that idea. It's like when you go to a museum and you know that there are boxes full of shit behind closed doors that they haven't put out on display. It's like the same concept. It's like what was cut that we didn't see that maybe hooked it all together a bit more neatly. I don't know. Just a theory.
It's there's these brief flashes where they show the house and there's naked cultists around it, but it lasts for like a fourth of a second. But in the original version, those scenes were a half an hour long. So, I mean, that's where the cut is. And no.
Wait, what cut are we talking about here? Are we talking about cutting film, or are we talking about determining what religion someone is based off of cuts?
Wow. That went weird.
Circumcision jokes.
Oh, man.
I need an adult.
No, there will be no adults. Hey, I want to take this in a really weird, different way. I read this theory, and I want to know what you guys think of it. So, when Annie's talking to Peter, she tells him she didn't want to be his mom, and that she repeatedly tried to have a miscarriage, right?
Right.
I read a theory that Charlie is, for lack of a better term, developmentally disabled because of attempts at a miscarriage. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, that's it's quite feasible, isn't it? But it's just such an icky thing to think about. It's just like I think again that's why I struggle with this film so much, because as a mother, like the idea of harming your child deliberately is just so awful. Kind of hard to get your head around, like kind of hard to. But yeah, it's a believable theory.
And then of course the whole, I didn't do it to try to kill you, I was trying to save you. You know, like that's such deep characterization and such a core belief. Yeah. And I mean, it just sums up so much of Annie's character. And I don't know, I haven't been able to get this theory out of my head now since I read it. And I'm just like, huh.
Maybe she knew deep down inside what was going on, and maybe she'd seen more than she let on as she was a child, or maybe she was trying to prevent any further tragedy and stuff. Who knows? Or maybe she's just a psychologically very disturbed woman who didn't want to be burdened with the responsibility of another child and all the stress that goes with it, especially given that she wasn't bonding with her existing child that well. Maybe it was self-preservation as well. I've definitely been there myself. I've definitely felt, like you need to preserve your own sanity sometimes, particularly with kids, as I'm sure we all have. So, some of us are more fragile than others, I think. And again, it's quite for me, that's quite a uniquely female sentiment, because mothers are meant to nurture. So the idea that somebody would do the opposite of that, but then also her mother is the opposite of that as well. Her mother is a demon worshipping Satanist. So not Satanists, whatever they are, paymonists. I don't know what the word is, but again, that's why that whole concept of motherhood has just been twisted and inverted and just turned on its head completely. And again, maybe that's also why you don't really like the characters that much, because they're not. It's so shocking to you. We all try to be good people and good parents and loving mothers and fathers and stuff, and none of that happens here at all. It's all a mess.
So Annie, does a lot of different things to deal with her grief, including trying to go to, or at least going to, group grief counseling, where, one of the members recognizes her after, one of the times that she tries to ditch it. And this lady comes back, and of course it turns out that she's part of the cult, but Annie doesn't know that. But as part of, I guess, this healing process, the lady sells her on, hey, we're going to perform a seance. I met this guy. He did this thing. I didn't believe it at first, but hey, there was this neurosurgeon who was there, a really smart guy, and he believed it. And even the first time I watched it, I'm sitting there thinking, like, I know a fucking scam when I see one.
Yeah.
Something is going on. Like, either she's doing this because she's a, I don't even want to say a vulnerable character. She's she's a non-threatening character, the woman that runs up to Annie, because she's a little old lady. You don't expect little old ladies to be up to no good, despite, a lot of grim fairy tales. You're not expecting her to be one of these people. And her idea is, hey, I know you're grieving. You're suffering from loss. I got an idea. Come to my apartment. I'll show you, I'll show you something. It shows her how to commune with the dead, and the dead respond back and stuff. But what really gets me is, how willing Annie is to trust this lady, even after she sees all these signs that say, like, no, I should turn around and go home. What did you guys think about that scene? But then also, what do you guys think about the seance? I mean, have you been to a seance? Have you performed one, gone to a medium, fortune teller, palm reader, any of that stuff before? And no, Zoltar does not count, James.
I've never
Gemma,
been.
go ahead.
I want to be big.
I've never been to a seance. I have. So there's a very, very, very famous haunted pub in a place called Wootton Under Edge, which is not very far away from here at all. And it's open maybe like once or twice a year. And I was visiting a friend nearby, and it just so happened to be open. So we inside and had a look. I think it's one of England's most haunted buildings, and it's a pub. I think it's called the Lamb. I can't really remember, but it's in Wootton Under Edge, so you can look it up later. And it was an open day, and in one of the rooms upstairs, each room is filled with kind of clutter and junk, and it's all quite atmospheric. And they were having not a seance, but they were doing readings, and sort of checking the room for presence, paranormal presences, and talking, and I can tell you that I don't believe in any of that shit. I'm quite a pragmatic, straightforward person, and I just don't believe in any of it at all. But I did walk into the room, and I did feel a bit uncomfortable, because although I don't believe in any of it, the thought did cross my mind that, well, what if I did feel something or hear something? I wouldn't be very happy about that. So then I left quite quickly. And I'm quite a rational, scientifically sort of rooted person, and not superstitious in the slightest. But it did make me feel slightly nervy, like the idea that, okay, actually, nobody's ever really definitively proved or disproved either way. It's like most things that are big in concept like that nobody actually completely knows or doesn't know. So there's always this tiny little possibility that stuff is real. And I don't really think I wanted to be confronted with it. So maybe it's feasible for Annie, who's like a vulnerable woman who's been through multiple instances of trauma, hasn't got a very good grip on anything, to perhaps be quite malleable to pressure and to wanting to have some hope. I think that whole interchange was quite sad, really. And I think it was very telling that she was at a grief counselling service when she met the woman. I forget what her name is.
Joan,
that's it. And she preyed on her at her most vulnerable, because Annie doesn't look like the sort of person that would enjoy sitting down in a group talking about her innermost feelings. But she is there, so she clearly knows she needs help. So she's clearly feeling all kinds of bad. She originally goes for her mother's death, doesn't she? And then she loses her daughter. So yeah, it's believable to me that she could be preyed upon in that way and want to be led.
So I've never been to a seance. I played with Ouija boards a lot in high school. I had an incident where we had one that caused some problems, and we took it to a park to burn it, and it wouldn't burn. Wow. And no matter what we poured on it, it just wouldn't burn. And so I have a friend from high school who still thinks that's like the scariest thing ever, and I'm just like, maybe it was made out of something that doesn't burn. I don't fucking know. So I don't know. None of that stuff really interests me. I have a lot of questions about what happens after we die, or I have certain relatives I would like to speak to again, but I don't know, maybe I spend too much time in horror world and I'm like, it's just asking for problems. What's wrong with you? You know? So no, I haven't. But what about you, Don?
I have not. However, during this movie, there were a couple of moments that came to mind. I've gone to a wonderful place in Tombstone, the Birdcage Theater. I think it's called the Birdcage.
Yes, it is.
Where they claim kind of the same things, and I looked it up. Gemma, it's the Golden Fleece.
That's it.
England.
Yeah.
And it was the same type of thing. It was like, hey, this is the most haunted place in the area. Come check it out. And going through, check some things out. And I was like, okay, this is a cool place to hang out, but I don't believe that anything's here. With that being said, I didn't go back for the nighttime tour because I was like, you know what? I'm not going to fuck with anything that happens to be here because if it is here, I'm going to leave it alone. But while I was watching this movie, it became apparent to me how I missed some of the signs or really didn't pay attention to stuff that my own parents were saying about stuff like this. Like my mom would be completely checked out. If you brought a Ouija board to her, maybe now she might play along, but 20 years ago, she would probably take me right to church and start praying and involving all types of people. Now she might play around with it, but then say just don't leave that shit in my house. But my father, on the other hand, is kind of one of those people that he's interested. He's not sold on it, but he's interested as far as I'd check it out. And this has to deal with our own family history because he revealed to me in when I was bullshitting about something one day. And I said, oh, yeah, it'd be great to pull some voodoo stuff on somebody. And my dad's like, yeah, you know who used to do voodoo? I'm like, who? It's like, your great-grandmother. I used to walk in, and my grandma was always doing X, Y, and Z and doing this, and this. And I'm like, well, what was it like? And he said, there's nothing like in the movies. It's pretty boring. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? So anytime something weird would happen in my family, somebody... And I always jokingly said, if somebody pissed me off, my ancestors would get them back, whether it's my grandmother or great grandmother. And, I looked at it as kind of a funny thing, but I would never myself engage in openly trying to fuck with something that's out there. I don't know if it is. I don't believe in it, but I also don't want to take that chance.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be sensible about these things, right?
So while we're talking about the seance, I want to hit my favorite thing that Joan does. So Joan has this chalkboard, and she tells this big long story about her grandson who died and how he's going to write on the chalkboard. And of course, the chalk actually moves, blah, blah, blah. But what's great about it is she says that when you do this, it has to be an extremely personal item that you bring to the seance, right? But when you see Joan earlier and she's at the craft store, her back seat is full of these chalkboards. And so number one, it's complete bullshit. I don't even know if this kid existed that's in this story. But number two, right. I love that there's multiple chalkboards because the multiple chalkboards don't serve a purpose. It's not like she's going to keep doing this to people, right? It's solely like Aster going, hey, everybody, look at the chalkboards over here.
In case you missed that one, there are 50 more.
I just find it hilarious that she has so many. But yeah, there you go.
I don't know. As soon as she pulled out the chalkboard and was talking about touching the glass, but don't apply pressure to it, the character from Ghost that Whoopi Goldberg played, I heard her in my head. And I was like, "You're a danger, girl," and I was just waiting for some shit to happen.
A good film. One final question. That's purely because I'm flicking through the movie stills on IMDb as we're talking. And
perfect. Go for it.
Yeah. In the very final scene, in the treehouse, which I think is beautiful, and there's a kind of pseudo Christ-like statue of who you assume is like a representation of Paimon as well, standing behind Peter and the congregation. And it's got like a dummy's body with like a crook stick and something and a crown and rays of light coming out, and it's a decapitated head. And I can't figure out whose head it is, like whether it's Annie's mum's head or whether it's Charlie's head, because we were talking about why is Charlie not present in that congregation.
Ooh.
So yeah, it's on the IMDb stills. There's a decapitated head on top of this kind of icon at the back of the room. And
interesting.
Yeah, I can't figure out who it is.
And that's a nice touch, because when you see the drawing of Pimon in the book, you know, he's got 3 little severed heads hanging from his belt.
Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, you know, multiple people lose their heads in this film, as well as some birds and some other people. But
the hair length looks like Charlie's hair length. It's kind of hard to make out on the actual picture because the face is quite decomposed. Maybe Charlie is there in some reduced form. It's quite interesting.
That's when the family gets that phone call and saying, "We haven't been able to find your daughter's head anywhere."
Sorry, I was looking at the pictures and I just came across it and thought, oh.
No, because now it's going to have to be a couple more viewings, and I'm sure people who listen to this episode are going to go back and look and say, "Oh no, that's Steven's head. It didn't burn up." You know, anything could possibly go on there.
So I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this. So Gemma, I want to thank you one more time for coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun, and I like that we got to disagree and talk about different reasons that we believe what we believe, because I love that, and I think that that's what horror does. Like we talked about, you know, horror is supposed to leave questions, and when there's questions and when we're constantly thinking about it, the terror lives on, and that's always a good thing to me. But so thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell our listeners one more time about your books or anything else you want to talk about, and where we can find you on social media?
Sure. So I have 4 books. One is called Dear Laura. One is called White Pines, and the other 2 are short story collections called Cruel Works of Nature and Till the Score is Paid. You can get all of those on Amazon. You can type Gemma Amor into Amazon and I will pop up. And the same goes for social media. Just search for my name. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. I'm more active on Twitter than most other places. I'm happy to chat and talk and hang out and do whatever. I'm a very friendly person. That's me really in a nutshell. And if you are interested in any of my short stories or audio drama, then you can find both the No Sleep podcast. You can find the No Sleep podcast, Shadows at the Door, and Calling Darkness wherever you can find podcasts.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that's me.
That wraps everything up. So as always, I am James Sabata.
And I'm Don Guillory.
And we'll see you next week here on the Necronama.com.